Okay.
It's just a battery that was bad.
All right, you want to know about my grandparents.
Yeah. So, names, nicknames.
I don't know much about my mother's family. Robert Lee Templeman married my grandmother, and I don't know her name at all.
And this is on your mother's side.
On my mother's side, they lived in Stafford County, Virginia, which is the ancestral home of the Lees. We are related to the Lees, but through Light Horse Harry rather than through Robert E. He was a farmer, and apparently he was a good farmer because he donated the land for the Stafford County or the Stafford Baptist Church, which is where they all went to church, and is where my mother is buried. And I don't know where it is. We went there one time, but I've never been back since, so I'm not sure exactly where it is. My grandfather died before I was born. My grandmother died the day my sister was born, which was November the 22nd, 1943. So I don't remember her at all. My mother was the youngest of 11, so she had lots of brothers and sisters, and there's an interesting story about them too. One of them, Morris, was her brother, and he was a developer, and from what I understand from most people that I've talked to, a real SOB. But a woman named Eleanor married Morris because she was desperate to get into the DAR, the UDC, and the Society of the Lees of Virginia. So Morris provided her entree into those. She wrote a book on Arlington.
What's the DAR and the UDC?
DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, United Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Society of the Lees of Virginia. And she wrote a book on Arlington, and we have it. It's a historical book of Arlington. During her research, she found out that she personally was closer related to the Lees than Morris was, so she divorced him. One of her older sisters, Lillian, married a man named Willard Quick, and they lived in Arlington. And Uncle Willard, strangely enough, had polio as a child, and his right shoulder was deeply affected. And so ever since I've known Uncle Willard, his arm was withered and he could barely lift it to shake your hand. But he was a scientist with the federal government, and she was a secretary with one of the secret branches of the government, and they lived over on Glebe Road. And my mother went to live with them when she got old enough to become a secretary, and that's how she met my father. So I don't really know much about the Templemans, other than I've got double first cousins, which means that my father and their mother are brother and sister, and my mother and their brother are brother and sister. So every time I went to any kind of a family reunion, whether it was the Templeman or the Mitchell side of the family, there were my four double first cousins. Ray, Francis, both of which were older than I was, and then Edward and Judith, who were younger than even Kathy was. I don't believe there are any of the Templemans that are still living in Stafford County. I believe that all of them are much closer to the Washington area. Now, my father's parents, my grandfather,
So where did your mother's father die?
he died before I was born, but
Okay.
I don't know. I was born September 1940, so he died a couple of years before, probably in 38 or something. I knew my other grandparents very well because they lived. My grandfather died when I was 15. My grandmother died, I think, after we were married. Isn't that right?
Yes.
So I knew both of them. Frank Raymond Mitchell was born on a farm outside Syracuse, New York. He has a twin brother, had a twin brother. I don't know whether fraternal or identical. I don't know how he met my grandmother. My grandmother was Lillian Rhodes from Biloxi, Mississippi. When they married, this was before 1900. I can't remember, 1898 or something around there. Both families disowned them. Neither would talk to either one of them because they had a mixed marriage, north and south. My grandfather
That's
worked.
that's where Rhodes comes into the family.
Yes.
Like John Rhodes, Alan Rhodes.
Right. My grandfather worked for Western Electric, and he was a foreman. His job was to move from city to city as the only full-time Western Electric employee. He would go into a town, he would hire a crew to build a central office, and then he would hire the crew to install the basic equipment, and then the engineers would come in and fine-tune the equipment. And he must have been a rough old man because, as my father tells it, the foreman was the foreman only as long as he could physically whip any man in his crew. So he went from town to town, and apparently that's where he met my grandmother, somewhere. And they were married, and he continued to do that. They were leaving upstate New York, and I don't remember what town it was in upstate New York, when my father was delivered. He was delivered in Salamanca, New York. That was a stop on the train track. So they went into the hospital, and he lived there 7 days in Salamanca, New York. And they came south, and I don't remember where they came. Eventually, they ended up in Atlanta. My father went to Tech High, which is where Grady High School is now. Boys High and Tech High shared the same building, and he went to Tech High. But before he went to Georgia Tech, my grandparents moved back to the Washington area. I believe that's where they had come from at some point in time, but I know they were in western Pennsylvania at one point in time. They were in Kentucky at one point in time. I don't remember all the details. But they lived about a mile from the town of Clarendon in Arlington, Virginia, about 2 blocks from Glebe Road and Wilson Boulevard. I already mentioned Glebe Road. That's where my Uncle Willard and Aunt Lillian lived, which is where my mother lived, which is how my father met her, because he would take his sister Margaret over to Lillian's house, where Uncle George, and they would have a date, so that's how they met. Anyway, I don't remember all the details of it, but that's how I got double first cousins.
Was he the eldest?
My father was the eldest. Then Margaret, then Ray, which was strange because he was John Rhodes and my grandfather was Frank Raymond. And so Frank Raymond Jr. was the second son, not the first son. And then my Aunt Myra Lillian is still alive. She was the youngest of the crew. She's about 90-something now and lives in Western Virginia. I can't remember. Front Royal, Virginia. Thank you. My grandparents lived about a mile from where my parents bought a house, not long after I was born. So I used to spend lots of times over at my grandparents' house. They had a double lot. My grandfather had retired by then and loved to garden. Had a beautiful backyard, had apple trees, loved pansies, loved planting pansies. My grandmother was a wonderful cook. She was about 5'2" and about 5'2" across. She was a real roly-poly dumpling, but she loved to cook. My grandmother was allergic to tomatoes, or at least she said so. And I became allergic to tomatoes because my grandmother was allergic to tomatoes. I would not eat tomatoes. I'd eat tomato soup. I'd eat tomato ketchup. I'd eat, chili sauce. Didn't matter. I just wouldn't eat raw tomatoes, which caused all sorts of consternation. But it was simply because my grandmother didn't eat raw tomatoes. But she loved everything else, and we always got together at their house for Christmas and for Thanksgiving. There were the 4 brothers and sisters and their wives. My Uncle Ray married a woman named Mildred, so she became Mildred Jr. because my mother, Mildred, was the elder, so they just called her Mildred and Mildred Jr. And then we had Ray and Francis and Edward and Judith, and Aunt Marlene and Uncle Norman had 3 children, and Mom and Dad had 2 of us, and Uncle Ray and Mildred Jr. adopted Debbie because for some reason they couldn't have children. So all of us gathered at the Mitchell house for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and I never got graduated to the adult table. I was always at the children's table. Ray and Francis both left the children's table, leaving me the eldest to take care of all the rest of them. My grandfather died when I was 15. I was in summer camp, and I wanted to go home for the funeral, but didn't. He had died in 1953. He purchased a brand new 1953 Oldsmobile. And I can remember sitting in that Oldsmobile with him while we listened to the Masters tournament where, oh my gosh, what's his name? The amateur was leading until the Sunday tournament. I can't remember his name now. But anyway, my grandfather was fascinated. He never played golf, but he was fascinated by this amateur leading the Masters in this beautiful Oldsmobile. He only got to drive it for 2 years before he died. My grandmother continued to live on at the house in Arlington for a while, and then she moved in with my Uncle George and Aunt Margaret on their farm. They had a farm out in Fairfax County, or Falls Church, or one or the other, I don't remember which. And they built a room for her on the porch, and she lived there about 5 years before Uncle Norman and Aunt Myra Lillian bought a house with a separate apartment for my grandmother. And so she lived there until after we were married. I would guess probably 62, 63, maybe 64 was when she died.
How old do you think she was?
She was probably born in, I would guess, 82. So she probably lived to be about 80 or 83, 84. My grandfather was a little older than she was. So when he died, he was probably still in his 60s. But that's the story of my grandparents from both sides.
What about other hobbies that they might have had? So you talked about gardening. Or
Gardening.
What other kind of stuff do you remember?
Like I said, I don't remember anything about my mother's parents.
Right.
My grandmother, I don't think she did sewing. I think she just cooked. That's it. Everything that I can remember about her was based in the kitchen. And she would cook wonderful meals. My grandfather would putter around in the garden. And he had a wood shop, a workshop, I should say, not a wood shop, a workshop. So he had tools so he could do household maintenance. But other than that, I really don't know much about his other hobbies. He didn't play golf. He was always there. I mean, I would walk over to their house after school and go up. My Uncle Ray had left a Lionel train from 1912 in the attic. And I would go over and play with the Lionel train.
Electric train?
Electric train. Didn't think anything about it.
Hard to get parts?
Well, it didn't need parts. It just ran and ran and ran. But I saw sometime in the 80s that a train of that vintage had sold for over $100,000. It was one of the original Lionels. So that's all I can remember about them.
Did we talk about their siblings? You talked somewhat.
Again, nothing about my mother's parents. I
Right.
don't know anything about their siblings. I know she had 10 brothers and sisters.
And Maurice and
Morris
Morris.
and Eleanor, and Aunt Lillian and Aunt Macy and Aunt Florence were the three who gave us the eggs, mostly Aunt Lillian. She was the one who did the eggs that we still use on Christmas trees, and I think you have a couple of them, if I remember correctly. She lived in Florida, in Princeton, Florida, I don't know, just below Miami, before you started out onto the Keys. She lived there until the hurricane came through. She was in an assisted living home. She owned most of it. And it tore down the house, and they had to move somewhere else, and she just never got over it. Virginia married one of my mother's brothers, and they lived in Florida. He was with one of the airlines, and I remember she had an aneurysm, but she refused to get it repaired because she said she'd lived long enough. And sure enough, one day the aneurysm just burst, and she was gone. She was a neat old lady. Enjoyed being with her when we was down in Miami. But as far as I know, my grandfather, I know, had a twin brother. My paternal grandmother, like I said, the family disowned them. They never really talked about it at all. It was as if they were orphans to a large extent. Although when I was 3, we did go to Lake Ontario for a vacation, and we stopped by the family farm to see his twin brother. I am told that. I don't really remember that. The only thing I can remember is my cousin Ray and I would start out walking towards Lake Ontario, and we'd always have to turn around and come back and use the outhouse. So that's my only memory of that trip, was running back to the outhouse, and whoever got there first, the other one had to wait. That was always me, because Ray was about 4 years older. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, you want to do Mom?
Well, I want to see if I can think of anything else. Can you think of anything, Mom?
Well, Cat, he has a sister.
Oh no, we'll get into the whole.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
later.
this is just more about
Grandparents right now.
Okay.
grandparents. So, what about friends in Washington D.C. Of your grandparents? Like,
Well, he was a deacon in the, what was the Baptist church in Washington? Can't think of the name of it right now. He was chairman of the board of deacons. He was a deacon, sang in the choir, had a beautiful voice. We went into Washington to church all the time, because that's where my father and his siblings went to church. I don't remember friends of theirs. Like I say, it was every time I was over there, it was either just them or we were full of family. So that's about all.
did he retire from Western Electric?
Western Electric. Matter of fact, he was still working during the 30s. My father got out of Georgia Tech in 32, couldn't find a job. Got a job with Western Electric, but wouldn't tell my grandfather, because my grandfather would not have allowed him to work because of everybody thinking that he had gotten him the job. So my father worked on the night shift and wiring up switchboards. And I can remember him telling about the time he was wiring up a switchboard, leaning over, putting the wires on, and somebody put battery onto the wiring, and he felt the fillings in his teeth vibrating from the electrical shock. I think probably around 35, after he'd been there for 2 or 3 years, he finally told my grandfather, and by then it was okay because obviously he had earned his own keep without my grandfather's influence. Don't remember when my grandfather retired. Ever since I've known of him and known him, he had been retired there not far from Clarendon. Right across from the church that's there now. The church wasn't there, that was a wood. But the church was built right across the street, and we went to see it when we were in Arlington. And it looks much the same, but nobody lives there that's related to us anymore. Okay. Anything else you can think of?
I'm sure I will. We'll come back.
All right.